Good afternoon. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you all a quick legislative update with Josh Crossan from Ed Allies. Well, first, Heather, how are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks.
Awesome. And Josh, thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. I'm doing as well as we can in the middle of session.
Yeah, I do not envy you. Session is never fun, and I cannot imagine doing it virtually. So thank you for doing what you're doing, but also thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. And so we were hoping you could give us a quick just rundown around like what is the landscape of education policy and education politics at the state level right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been a strange one. I'll say that I'm lucky to have a strong policy team and research team at Ed Allies that can help navigate this. But we're doing all things virtually, so there are very few people at the Capitol. If you want to testify, you got to do it over Zoom, and that has its own challenges. The Capitol is just frankly not as open to the public as it should be or as it has been. But generally speaking, we're still moving. The legislature is still pushing forward on education bills, on policy bills, on funding bills. Right now, Minnesota, we have a Senate that's run by Republicans and a House that's run by Democrats. And in the Senate, Senator Chamberlain is the chair, and his really big focus is around literacy. He wants to tackle our low literacy rates among our children and train educators around better ways to teach around literacy.
Okay.
With Senator Chamberlain, he also has a really low target. I think he has $152 million to play around with for education. That might sound like a lot of money, but that's only about 1.5%. If you were to put all of that money on a per pupil increase, that's only 1.5% increase. So it's a pretty low target that he's working with. Representative Richardson is she's the chair of the Education Policy Committee in the House, and her big focuses are where the Posse Caucus, the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus, where they're leading on increasing teacher diversity, improving the outcomes for kids of color and low-income learners. And she's also really focused on dismissals. Dismissals have been she's been a champion on reducing suspensions and expulsions in Minnesota for a really long time. And as chair, she's kind of bringing that passion to the work. So that's kind of where we're seeing in the House side for money. They haven't released their targets yet. We don't know what's going to happen there, but we're all waiting with bated breath.
Yeah, cool. So when you so you've already started talking a little bit about targets. So let's move just quickly into education funding and finance. First, what is a target? And then second, what is happening with, funding, and what are we looking at, especially in this, unbelievable year that we've been living through?
Yeah, absolutely. So what is a target? That's a great question. In Minnesota, we have leaders within the House and the Senate, and they decide, they have the budget, Minnesota's budget, and they say, all right, I'm going to put this much into education. I'm going to put this much into healthcare. I'm going to put this much into tax cuts. And the leadership kind of divvies up where the money's going to go. And they tell their chairs of education, chairs of health and human services, that's how much money you have to play with. It's kind of like an allowance for the chairs. And the chairs have to work within that specific budget. So they can say, I'm going to put some money into programming like literacy, like training educators, or I'm going to put all of that money into increasing the per pupil formula. And so that's kind of what we're expecting. Also, the governor has his own budget, right? He has an idea of how much we should be spending. And this is all based on forecasts. So you probably hear a lot about, oh no, Minnesota's in a deficit, or oh yay, we have a surplus. But whatever that news is, that's what our legislators are working with.
Okay, awesome. So are we in a surplus or a deficit this year? We're in a surplus. Okay, that's great. So we're in a surplus. And so then what's the do you know what the governor's target is, or the governor's budget for education is?
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me right now. We're in about $1 billion surplus, and the governor's really going to be focusing on programmatic spending in education. So he does
Okay.
have significant increases in there for education. A lot of it is going to be around programs. And
Okay.
again, programs are like training for educators, are like food programs. They're very specific programs that within schools. Whereas the per pupil funding formula for all of you like nonprofit leaders out there, that's your general operation spending. You can use that for anything within reason. But programmatic spending is kind of a little bit more focused.
Okay. Awesome. So what happens then if there's a difference in what Senator Chamberlain wants to spend and Gazelka wants to spend versus what Governor Walz wants to spend? How does that get resolved? What happens there?
And what Chair Dabney wants to spend as well.
Yeah.
They're going to have to come to the table. Either way, their policy bills are going to look very different. The education policy bill was actually released last week. That's pretty early for an education policy bill. But there's a lot of stuff in there that I can't see Senator Chamberlain including in his policy bill. So with policy and funding, they're going to have to come to the table and negotiate. So they can negotiate policy, they can trade policy. What can also happen is Chamberlain can say, you know what, I want to increase my money. I'll increase my 152 million to 500 million if you take out this policy, and this policy, right? So there's going to be a lot of trading going on. And this all happens behind closed doors. We don't know. This is how Minnesota works. It's not a transparent process. We don't know what's going to be traded away or what's going to be negotiated. But this is what we know is going to happen.
All right. So then my last question before we get into our top 5 issues for you, Josh, is, overall, are we looking at, more money for schools? Do you think we're looking at more money for schools, less money for schools? How does the money coming from the federal government and all that play into it? What does that look like?
Yeah. So federal government is pitching in a fair amount to schools. You're going to see that on your budget sheets, and it's going to be nice for folks who are running schools. Either way, the state is going to be putting more money into schools. I think this is my prediction, my crystal ball. If Chamberlain is going to come in with $152 million more for schools, that just means that is the base. That's where we're starting from. And I believe that we're going to get anywhere between $152 million and wherever the governor and Democrats want to go. I think that's going to be our bookmarks.
Okay. So Heather, as the parent of 2 kids in Minneapolis public schools, how does this all sound to you right now in terms of we have, a lot of different players who have a lot of different priorities. All of it sounds hopefully good for kids when we're talking about literacy and dismissals and teachers of color. But also it seems like we are very, very far on how much we want to spend. What is your takeaway as you're listening to this as a parent?
Yeah, I think about the idea of people going in and making deals behind closed doors without having a sense of the communities or what the communities need or want, and how often electeds are choosing for and maybe aren't in relationship with the communities that they're serving. And so I hear the word programs and I think, oh, I hope that's what we need.
Yeah, for sure. Well, all right, Josh, thank you for that. So let's get into the nitty gritty of some of the bills that are moving right now through the legislature. So we have our top 5 things that we're following that we want to talk about. So let's start at the top. Let's go with dismissals and suspensions. What's happening with that? You said that Representative Richardson, that's one of her main focuses. And so what's on the table?
Yeah, absolutely. So dismissals have been somewhat of an uphill battle. When you do polling out there, about 50% of community members, parents want to see change around dismissals, 50% don't. So it's kind of walking a tightrope around this issue. Last year, we were able to ban suspensions on pre-K kids. So the number one group that's often suspended and expelled more than K-12 kids are pre-K students, 3 and 4-year-olds. So last year we were able to say no suspending 3 and 4-year-olds. If you do expel 3 and 4-year-olds, you have to kind of go through a more arduous process on connecting them with the resources that they need. Now, and that was a bill that was really championed by Chair Richardson. Now we're hoping to expand that from pre-K to K3. So from kindergarten through 3rd grade, we're hoping to have that same suspension ban, and really strict requirements on if you're going to expel, these are the things that you need to do first before you go that route. So that's in there. It was heard in both the House and the Senate. It's currently in the House omnibus bill. We're still waiting to see what happens in the Senate. The other thing around dismissals, the Senate is really carrying this idea around community group accountability. How can districts bring parents, educators together to hold their districts accountable to the suspension policies or the dismissal policies that exist within their district? So it's a new idea that I think the Senate is running with, and something that the Solutions on Suspensions Coalition has been helping them move forward.
Okay. So why is suspensions and dismissals an issue that the Minneapolis community should be paying attention to? Why is it something we should care about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Minnesota is an outlier as a state. We suspend and expel Black students 8 times more often than white students. Nationwide, it's 3 times more often.
Wow.
We're also,
Wow.
yeah, right. Also for Native American students, we suspend and expel Native American students around 10 times more likely than white students, and nationwide it's about 5 times more likely. So we are an outlier in the state. Minneapolis is an outlier within the state. Minneapolis has the most suspensions and expulsions than any other district in the state. So when we talk about suspensions and expulsions and keeping kids in class, improving their behavior in the long term, finding restorative practices, letting them grow and be held accountable to their actions while also learning, like it's going to be beneficial for all students in Minnesota. It's going to be 10 times more beneficial for kids in Minneapolis, because it happens so often here. And I say here because I'm in North Minneapolis. So
yeah. So Heather, I mean, we've talked about this, right? We've seen this data. We just talked about this when we did our State of the Black Student conversation. How much more likely it is for a Black student or any student of color to be suspended than a white student, and then just the disproportionality within the district. And then we've also had a lot of conversations around some of the legislative agenda of Minneapolis Public Schools. How is it that Minneapolis Public Schools did not have this issue on their legislative agenda?
I think it's that. But also the thing I think that troubles me with that data is that I know from an experiential level how often I see students of color being sent home and not seeing it documented. So if those are the numbers, and I'll just say I was a volunteer in school, I saw the Black disciplinarian marching kids back to teachers' classrooms on repeat and saying, you cannot send this child to me if I don't have the paperwork to go with it, right? And teachers hoping to get around that accountability. And so even though those numbers are shocking and horrible, I think that our practice of pulling and pushing Black children and Native children out of the classroom is probably even worse than the data. And I'll say, as a volunteer, you get to be a fly on the wall, and you get to see it, and you get to see the patterns.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, like this is a high pressure pipeline. Like that is unbelievable, the amount, just how, of course, Minnesota stands out as a state in this issue, but then Minneapolis stands out within Minnesota, and then we wonder, why do we have nation leading opportunity gaps? And, we can point to all the reasons, and yeah, so frustrating. And so Josh, just one last thing on this issue. So you said that some people are, there's 50% of people that support, taking change on this issue, and then the 50% of people that don't. What are we seeing? Like, who's driving the opposition around, making sure that we don't we don't suspend 9-year-olds in our buildings? Like, who is leading the opposition to that, and who's really pushing for this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the opposition to any change around dismissals really comes from ignorance. And I don't mean that as a slight. I mean that as people just don't know a different way to discipline a student. Discipline, the root word of discipline comes from to teach, right? Disciple, to teach. And when we talk about discipline, it's so synonymous in people's minds that, oh, that must mean a suspension or expulsion. So I think the first thing that we need to do as a community is learn about the different ways we can discipline students without dismissing them, without moving them out of their educational environment. The other area is for people who do know the difference and do it anyways. They really see this as a crime and punishment issue. It's no longer an education issue. So if a student acts up or doesn't listen to authority, we have to punish them in the way that is most severe, which is suspending or expelling them. And we, as I think the Solutions Not Suspensions Coalition, are thinking of how do we change people's mindsets away from crime and punishment to what works. We know suspensions and expulsions do not work. How can we inspire them to use something else that does work, so we're not giving up on these students?
Yeah.
I'll just say the other thing that I observed a lot when I was volunteering when my kids were in elementary school was sort of a punitive type teaching specifically toward students. And so it was like, oh, you didn't do your work and you didn't do this thing, so you don't get to do any of the fun things that are happening, right? I have a very specific memory of we were running a store and it was fun and we brought in baked goods and everybody was excited, and two of the kiddos who needed math help the most, right? The teacher was like, nope, they are not allowed to do that fun thing with you outside of learning because they didn't do this and this and this today. And I said, but this might be the thing that helps them understand that this matters. You can't take away the experiential part of it. And I remember one of the students snuck behind the table to try to have that opportunity, and that teacher came and pulled him out by the arm and said, no, he is not allowed to have any fun at school today. And I think that mindset, like you talked about, Josh, of the idea of like what inspires children to learn versus like, I'm going to squash this person down until they in no way challenge me. There's a real crisis with the ability to believe in children and to teach them with inspiration and love.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. I used to say this all the time. I mean, I still say this. I shouldn't say I used to say this all the time. I still say this, is that we all say like, yes, education is a right. But the second that a student, does something that we don't like, we treat it as a privilege and we treat it as something that we want to take away. And so that's what we do every time we suspend a student. That's what we do every time we push students out. All right, so we need to keep moving though, because there are a lot more things that we have to cover. So let's talk, this isn't the thing to rush through, but let's talk about teachers of color. So Josh, what is going on with teachers of color? There's been a lot of movement, a lot of conversation. You two both were on a press conference earlier this week talking about some bills that were impacting teachers of color. So let's talk about them.
Yep. Yeah, let's first start saying there is no silver bullet in education. But there's one that's really close, and that's increasing the number of teachers of color. We know that more teachers of color means fewer suspensions and expulsions for kids of color in particular, and access to rigorous and relevant coursework for kids. So more kids are being referred to honors courses, AP courses, when they have a teacher of color who looks like them. And so you probably have seen in the headlines, teachers of color is a major priority at the legislature. It's a major priority for the state. It works. And so there are a couple of efforts to really focus on teachers of color. And one is a plainly stated one, the Teachers of Color Act. Now, this is a piece of legislation that invests in removing certain barriers that teachers of color face when they're going into teacher preparation programs or when they're exploring becoming an educator in high school.
What type of barriers are those? Sorry.
Yeah, so with some of those barriers, student teaching is often a barrier. Student teaching, for those of you who aren't educators, you have to take 3 months unpaid to teach a class and you have to pay tuition on top of that. So it's not only you're going unpaid for 3 months, but you also have to pay someone to allow you the opportunity to do student teaching. There are a lot of residency programs, mentorship programs that also offer the same experience. The Teachers of Color Act would say, here's a grant. While you're doing this, we're going to help you financially get through this process. So that's kind of one of the barriers. That's one of the bigger barriers that exist in the Teachers of Color Act addresses. So we have Teachers of Color Act. That's a kind of one that, just I'll say plainly, Ed Allies is as part of the Teachers of Color Coalition and supportive of the Teachers of Color Act there. The other area is around teacher layoffs. I know this has been a really heated issue over the last couple of years, but every single district in the state of Minnesota, Minneapolis included, lays teachers off based on seniority first and only, right? So in Minneapolis, we're doing so much to recruit teachers of color. We're doing so much to fill teacher shortage areas. I'm amazed by how the HR team is just like recruiting. But once layoffs have to happen, or once there are cutbacks, those teachers are the first to go. So we're doing a lot to recruit teachers of color and bringing them within the pipeline. And once they become teachers, we have to let them go if layoffs unfortunately have to happen. So there are 2 efforts right now going on at the Capitol. On the House side, they said that the districts and unions will come together and create a committee to protect 5% of their teachers. It doesn't specifically say 5% of teachers of color or teachers of color specifically. It just says, we hope that you'll protect teachers of color while you protect those 5% of teachers. So that's kind of how the House is addressing this issue. In the Senate, it simply says LIFO is a no-go. LIFO is illegal. You cannot use LIFO during layoffs. Personally, I think both plans are a little flawed. I think that the House isn't addressing teacher diversity directly. If we're going to protect teachers of color, we better say we're protecting teachers of color and just not hope that the people who've negotiated the first plan will do right by teachers of color again, right? We're not, pretty please, can you say teachers of color? And on the Senate side, it feels like whack-a-mole. It feels like we're saying, don't do LIFO, but then we'll implement a new layoff policy that lays teachers of color off. Are we going to just keep going to the legislature over and over and over again saying, okay, now you can't use this policy, now you can't use this policy? We need to be very intentional about protecting teachers of color and teachers in shortage areas in our layoff policies.
Yeah.
And the last thing is around licensure, and this has been a big issue for Ed Allies, been a big issue for you all. One of the major barriers to teaching is around licensure, is around who is accepted into these programs, who can become a teacher through preparation, who has the ability, the privilege to become a teacher. And so one area that we've really been focusing on is creating multiple pathways that look at preparation as much as experience and effectiveness, and keeping those teachers within the classroom and not having their licenses taken away. There's a bill right now, HF 1376, that would close the pathway, 10 of the 12 pathways to a license, and anyone currently on that pathway, anyone in the classroom currently with a license, would have their license revoked. 21% or 25% of our teachers of color are in the classroom through these pathways. And if this bill goes forward, many of them are going to have their licenses taken away. So while we're talking a lot about increasing teachers of color, we also need to think about the policies that would have negative ramifications, negative effects on teachers of color in the teacher workforce.
Yeah. So really quick, I know you mentioned 3 different bills within this. So who's, again, leading on the push to increase teachers of color, and who's, slamming the brakes and saying like, look, this isn't the way, or whatever, all the reasons, right? Like, yeah.
Well, and I think it's a mixed effort too. So the Senate is also thinking about different programs like Black Men Teach, the Sana Foundation. These are all nonprofits that are also thinking about increasing teacher diversity. So that's where the Senate's probably going to lean. It's actually funny that the Teachers of Color Act and the licensure language that pushes teachers of color out are often led by the same people. So Senator Kunish, once Representative Kunish-Pudin, is the lead author of the Teachers of Color Act, or was last year. She's no longer, but she's a co-author now. She was the lead author of the Teacher of Color Act and the lead author of the licensure bill to kick teachers that would disproportionately push teachers of color out. And when I ask this question, they'll often say, well, we want to make sure that teachers go through the systems that we've designed and that we've created. We did not create those systems for teachers of color, but we want to make sure that they go through those systems. And we want to close off those those other pathways so that they're forced to kind of go through those systems. I think it's an all hands on deck approach. We need to allow teachers to go through those systems and remove those financial and time barriers. And we need to allow for different pathways that look at experience and effectiveness as part of teaching. We need to do both. For a lot of legislators, it's either or.
Yeah. So I can tell you why Minneapolis should be paying attention to this issue. In Minneapolis, we have nearly 2,800 teachers. Almost 2,300 of them are white. And that's it. Like, that's the reason. And then if you want to get even more granular, Heather, what grade are your kids in right now?
They're in 7th grade.
How many teachers of color have they had?
0.
All right, let's move on. So let's talk about compensatory aid.
Can I just say one more thing about Minneapolis?
Sure.
Minneapolis has the most tier 1 or the most tier 2 teachers in the state. So like I said, when we're taking those licenses away from tier 2 teachers, it's going to impact Minneapolis more than any other district in the state.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, I was being flippant before, but this is so easy. Like, why are we trying to do anything that would risk pushing teachers of color out? Why are we trying to do anything that would create more barriers to get more teachers of color in? This just seems silly. And I hope, this is a space where we all can come together and say, like, let's just put the needs of our students, specifically our students of color, first, and get this done and stop putting adult issues or whatever before them.
Yep.
All right, let's talk about compensatory. So this is now more about education funding. So yeah, tell us a little bit about what's going on with compensatory aid.
Yeah. So compensatory revenue is a really fancy way of saying more money for districts that have high rates of low-income learners. So kids on free and reduced price lunch. Right now, if a school has 80% low-income learners, they get compensatory aid for each and every one of those kids. Any kid above 80% gets no aid. It caps off at that 80% level. Before, it used to start at the 20% level, right? In the 1960s, when we created the compensatory revenue, it was a way for wealthier districts to kind of compensate for lower income districts. So, the 20% level, once you were above that, you would start getting more money to kind of help out, be more equitable in your spending. We talk a lot about more money in schools. We really also need to be talking about equitable funding in schools. And I think you all do a great job of talking about the equitable distribution of schools and workforce, frankly, too. So the idea around compensatory aid is, let's lift that cap. Let's get rid of it. So if you are 90% low income students, you should be getting money in the door for those 90% kids just as much as anyone else would, right? So let's lift the cap. All low-income students should get that extra help. I'll just add the little caveat that more money doesn't necessarily mean a better education. We also need to make sure that we're investing in those classrooms, in those schools, in the correct way to allow students access to a rigorous education and a relevant education. So I think that, and I'll just add too, when you talk about money in schools, we're also thinking about universal access to lunch. When we're kind of moving formulas around over here, it might mess up formulas over here around feeding kids. And so the Hunger Solutions organization, it has put together a coalition of people to start thinking about this. So when we're increasing funding for schools, we're also able to feed kids and provide universal access. So they have a solution. It's super exciting that we're like thinking about all of the moving pieces, all to promote equitable distribution of our resources and feeding kids in the process.
Awesome. So kind of related to this, I wanted to just, since we're talking about funding, what's been a big topic within Minneapolis is around special education funding, right? And so Minneapolis will say that, they're underfunded by I think it's $56 million. They use that term every year to support their special education students. And so every year, it's always one of the top items on their legislative agenda. And so what's happening with the conversation around special education funding right now?
Yeah, so we're still waiting for those budget targets, right? So we still don't know what's happening with the House Finance Committee. Want to know how much they're going to be investing. With $152 million in the Senate, I don't know how much they'd be able to invest in those shortfalls for special education. And we also want to know what's just generally going on with special education. There were some short-term fixes for the cross subsidies that were in place a couple years ago. We don't know if that's going to continue. Those are up this year, so we're going to have to see legislation this year around that. But we haven't seen it yet. It hasn't been introduced yet.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I would not bank on the federal government following through on their promise. I know every single year we ask for IDEA funding, and every year we're disappointed. I don't expect the federal government to come through again this year. We need to start planning that they will never come through and be surprised when they do, rather than being disappointed every single year.
Yeah.
That said, the federal government is providing some additional aid through their COVID relief packages, but I don't suspect that they're going to come through with their full promise on IDEA funding.
And just really quickly, can you explain what IDEA is?
Yeah, so the federal government is supposed to provide all schools extra money for kids with disabilities, specifically around their IEP. And the federal government just hasn't done it. It's in law that they're supposed to provide that money for schools. They just haven't done it. And so every year we say every district says this. Minneapolis is no different. We're in the hole because we expected those federal dollars to come through. I'm just gonna say it bluntly. It's not gonna keep advocating for it, keep going for it. Be surprised when the money does come through, but expect it not to come through. It's just, yeah.
And then just really quickly, is that part of the reason why the state also won't step up to properly fund special education? Because they're like, well, this was a promise from the federal government.
A lot of fingers are being pointed to the federal government, rightfully so, but a lot of fingers are being pointed to the federal government. And in the meantime, we're derelicting our own duties to make sure that we're backfilling where the federal and the government needed to step in. It's not going to come through. State, you got to step up.
Yeah, now you're talking my language about advocating responsibility, because I think that's what a lot of our education leaders will do. But speaking of, let's talk about literacy. So what's going on with literacy at the Capitol? You'd mentioned Senator Chamberlain. This was a focus for him, a priority for him. So what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a priority. I think it's a priority for both the Senate and the House. There are a couple members in the House that are really excited about this. A couple of groups, Decoding Dyslexia, a lot of literacy groups that are out there that are really pushing the fundamentals of literacy, bringing back the scientific and proper ways to teach teachers to teach literacy. So there's a bill out there called Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling Grants. LETTERS for short. I hate when they make stupid acronyms out of really long titles. Anyway, so the LETTERS grant is about $1 million to help train teachers on the science and the proven way to teach kids how to read. We cannot have education justice. We cannot have education equity without literacy. And the sad fact is that only 1 in 3 of our kids of color are reading at grade level in Minnesota. So we need to do something. There's a sense of urgency right now at the Capitol to invest in programming so that we can build on what we know in science and put that into practice in our classrooms.
Yeah. And so, obviously this was a conversation that the school board had about whether they wanted to support the LETTERS bill. And they decided not to for a lot of different reasons. You can check out that video and our emotional take on that. But yeah, I mean, it's something that continues to be a conversation around what we're going to do as a state around literacy. And Heather, I mean, what what are your takeaways when you hear about, the push, and also, why it's not moving right now?
I mean, I'll just say, again, I go back to the experience of being in the classroom, and what I observe, right? So I think one of the problems with education is by the time we get to the groups of people who are making decisions, there are so many steps removed from actually being with students. And so, I've watched on repeat the way that we encourage students to pick a book that's interesting, and now you get to throw it around in the air from the beanbag corner for an hour, and that's your time to do literacy. I definitely, in my early years of education, was taught the skills of teaching phonemic awareness and letter sounds and letter names and memorizing those sight words and drilling on some of those things that, when my own kids finished first grade, and it was amazing. They were just quickly sent right to they need to go to reading support. They're behind. They're going to be in summer school. All of these things. And I said, can you just tell me what the metric is? Like, what are we testing them on? Well, there's just 100 words that we test kids on. And so when I talk to moms who are frustrated with their kids being behind, I'm like, there's 1,000 words. You can print them on the internet. If they can say and know each 100 as the grade goes on, your odds are that they're going to be doing really well. And I think the fact that we continue to make it a big mystical thing, it's an art and it's a science and we don't know, and kids have to be reading and interested, but there's still mechanics that children need in order to read. And when they have the mechanics, then the book can be interesting. If they don't have the mechanics, the book gets flipped in the air for an hour until students get to 4th and 5th grade, and then they're embarrassed that they don't know how to read. And so then they act out and they do all the things to get outside of the classroom so that their classmates don't see it, right? And I just think, at the end of the day, that, again, I'm just going to come back to the practical, being with kiddos, part of it is that we can teach kids the skills they need so that they can enjoy the books they want. You can't do it the other way around.
Yeah. So Josh, what for the letters bill specifically, what's the opposition right now? Is there any opposition coming against that bill, or what's going on?
I think the general opposition is, the scarcity of resources. That $1 million to train educators on how best to create a foundation of literacy means $1 million less somewhere else, and that kind of scarcity mindset is kind of hard. It would harm this bill's chances. Now, that said, again, literacy is the #1 priority for Senator Chamberlain, the chair of the Senate committee. And it's a general priority for the House as well. So I see in my crystal ball, I see very promising things happening with this bill, but I think that's where the opposition would lie.
I think it's great that you're able to read the future while some of our kids really can't read a book. So that is unfortunate, but I'm glad you have the skill. So let's tackle our last issue around college readiness and rigorous course taking. So what's going on at the legislature? I know Ed Allies has a strong push around this, and it's something that I'm deeply passionate about. So yeah, what's going on here?
Yeah, so I'll just say high school graduation rates are going up. Yay! Kids still are reading at the same level, and math proficiency is going down every year. So that doesn't really add up, right? We're increasing high school graduation rates, but kids aren't prepared to go to college and career, which means they get stuck in these development education courses. So what we're really thinking about is how do we get more students into those honors and those rigorous courses, those AP, IB, PSEO courses, when they are showing signs of excellence within that, so that they don't slip, right? So if they're in 4th grade, if they're really great at math, they're really excited about math, let's tap into that. Let's get them automatically right away put into the most rigorous math courses and let them grow and thrive within math. 2 things that we're working on. One, our World's Best Workforce Report, which is a report every school district needs to prepare. It's the only way that we have some transparency or accountability on how schools are doing. In that report, they're required to list how many kids are taking these rigorous courses. I'll just spoiler alert, not every district is reporting the number, but they're required to. They're required to list it, but not disaggregate it. So we don't know how many Black students, we don't know how many Native American students, we don't know how many kids with disabilities are taking these rigorous courses. And we're working on our bill right now that's very promising. That's just going to require them to disaggregate that data so we know how many kids are going into those courses. And the second thing, a couple of other states have adopted an automatic enrollment policy. So if you can show through objective measurements and objective data that you are proficient or mastering a certain subject, you're going to be automatically placed into the most rigorous course in your school. This is happening in a lot of different states. We actually had one of the states come and testify here in Minnesota. It's working really well. We pushed a bill. People said that looks too much like a mandate. So we scaled it back a little bit and said, we highly encourage districts to use objective measurements. And even that seems a little too challenging, but we're pushing this. The reason why is objective measurements close gaps. We know more kids of color and kids with disabilities are going to enter these rigorous courses way more than just recommendation. Usually when we recommend students for these courses, implicit bias slips in and says, I don't think you're ready for that course. Rather than using objective data.
Yeah. I will say for Minneapolis, they actually do produce a report usually every year that has their number of students who are taking advanced courses. They usually disaggregate it by race and other groups, I think. And so we show that data also when we were talking about the state of the Black student in Minneapolis public schools. And so we do want to give MPS props on that, but also we know that, not enough students of color are taking advanced courses in Minneapolis public schools. And Heather, I was just going to ask you, what has been the process for Hattie and Heston as they've been, asked to go in? Have they been asked to go into more rigorous classes, or what and how's that looked? And yeah, how do they feel about that process?
No, they haven't yet. Not an opportunity ever. There was a chance in their former district in 196. They were invited into an after-school specialty program, and that was earmarked specifically for students of color. And I don't recall seeing anything of value or of academically challenging in it. But I will say when we're talking about this conversation, what comes to mind for me is your recent conversation with our school board student representative, Janine, and how he talked about not even so much not being allowed, but actually teachers coaching him out of him requesting and them telling him, no, you cannot do that class. You are not ready for that. And when I watch him as a human interact on school board meetings and ask these questions, and he's got his whiteboard behind him and he's saying, excuse me, my mom needs to tell me things, I'm thinking there are ways in which this young man is more mature than I am. And the fact that a teacher would coach him out of an opportunity to learn, I think that our belief gap in students of color directly correlates.
Yep. And, I'll say this again, all of these issues are connected, right? We don't have enough teachers of color. And so we're suspending our students of color.
That's right.
And then we're also not allowing them to go into, our advanced courses, right? Like this isn't all like an accident. Like this is all very intentional. And we could do something about this really easily. And there's a number of ways to, get this done this year. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So we know all these bills exist. They're moving. They have opposition from one direction or another. So Josh, what are some real ways that Minneapolis parents who want equity at the state and at the district level, what are some ways that they can, let people know that or do something about this?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we listed the chairs, right? Chair Chamberlain, Chair Richardson, Chair Davney. Chair Davney is actually a Minneapolis representative. So so a lot of folks here will be reaching out and you're their constituent. Looking at you, Kenneth. But reach out to your chairs. Let them know. It's not as important for you to know the nuances of bills, just that how policy will impact you and your family. That's the important thing that you need to communicate to your legislators. Tell them your story. Tell them how, increasing teachers of color will help your kids, or how more equitable funding is a way to really invest in the future of your students. So call your chairs, call your legislators, and let them know too. Just share your story. Share your story about discipline or dismissals. Also, solutionsnotsuspensions.org if you have a story around dismissals, all are welcome to come to our conversations. We want your stories. We want to share your stories. We want you to share your stories. We're going to elevate you. But they don't know that it's a problem until you tell them that it's a problem. So we need you to speak out. And if you want to take action on any of the other pieces, licensure is included. Our website alliesmn.org has a take action button that just lets you click one button and send it away to your legislature, letting them know that please don't take licenses away from our teachers of color.
Okay. I mean, I hear that. And I guess my question is, does it matter to them if we email them? Or, if I call Chair Dabney, will he care?
I don't know about Chair Dabney as much as I know about other legislators, but I do know I do know legislators care. I'm kind of poking fun at Jim, but legislators care about what you think. I remember going to one legislative meeting and I said, this is something that we really are excited about. We need your support. And the legislator was like, I don't know, I'm not hearing from my constituents about this one. I texted 10 people that I knew were in that person's district. I said, can you reach out, let them know that you care about it? I came back an hour later and they said, oh my gosh, 10 people just reached out and said that they care about this thing. I'll sign on right away, right? So yes, absolutely, your voice does matter. And even if a legislator doesn't listen to their constituents, what's the harm, right? You took maybe 2-3 minutes of your day for the possibility that a policymaker is going to create policy based on on the story that you're telling. I think those are pretty good odds. You can either get policy to change or nothing will happen. Yeah.
Well, and I'll just add that, speaking of my 7th graders, they both took time this week to call all of their electeds. They put their address in, they got the list, and, started out being really nervous for the first phone call. And by the 6th phone call, they were like, Ilhan, and so I think we can all do it, and we have to kind of not fall into sort of collective apathy, right? And we need to do these easy actions.
Yeah.
Can I just say one more thing?
Sure.
Sometimes, and this I should say often, parents' voices and students' voices aren't often heard, and it's super unfortunate. But but the power doesn't lie often with students and parents, or people of color, or people with disabilities. So reaching out to your friends and people within the community that have the ear of legislators is also an act of revolution, right? Going to your principal and saying, dismissals matter to me. And I know you, principal, you're doing a good job of preventing suspensions and expulsions. Can you just let your legislator know that you're a principal and that you don't want other principals to suspend and expel their kids, right? That call from that principal is going to do a lot for a legislator who only cares about what principals have to say and not what parents have to say. So reach out to your networks and find power in yourself and find power within other people in your community.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for taking, 40-ish minutes to do this. And we know that you spend, 5 months of your life is, at the Capitol this year, the virtual Capitol. So thanks for distilling all of the important bills in 40 minutes with us. Heather, thank you as always for grounding us in what that will look like for students and what that means for students. And I hope y'all have a great rest of your day. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Thanks.